Well, we may start the last part of this first day of this 5th edition of the CIVITAS Academy. We will listen to the keynote lecture by Professor Daniel McDonald. I see him. Welcome. Thank you, Daniel, for being with us. Some words of introduction of Professor McDonald. He's a historian of Latin America and in a global perspective. Teaches at the Oxford University. His main themes of research are religion, urban history, and the Cold War in Latin America. On those themes, with a special focus on Brazil, he has published many articles, and I think he is preparing a book with the title Peripheral Citizenship, Popular Movements and the Progressive Catholic Church in Urban Brazil. He is also a postdoctoral research fellow for the Global Pontificate of Pius XII, Catholicism in a Divided World, a research network based also at the German Historical Institute in Rome and directed by Simon Gerhalvi, who has been involved in some of our previous events. So, the title of his lecture will be Religion, Politics, and Cold War, a Global Perspective. So thank you again, Daniel. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen with you real quickly. Can you see that?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and for having me. I'm so sorry that I couldn't be there in person. I had a prior engagement in Rome the week before, and then I am also going to be in Rome in December, so it didn't perhaps make sense to fly 3 times to Rome in 4 weeks. But this is such an exciting theme to be speaking to and to share a little some thoughts and a little bit about my own work at the moment. So just as a broad overview of what I'm going to talk about today, we started a little bit late, so I'll try to keep it within the time frame. I wanted to offer a few thoughts in a broad sense, in a theoretical and historiographic sense, about the Cold War and religion's place in it. I'm going to offer a few contentions, and then I want to explore those contentions within my ongoing research, which is focusing in part on inter-American Catholic relations and the Cold War. And so, as it was already mentioned, my prior work, my doctoral dissertation and my forthcoming book, which will be out with the University of California Press in June of next year, is Peripheral Citizenship. It looks at the liberationist Catholic Church in the urban peripheries of Sao Paulo, and the broader place of the liberationist and popular church during the military dictatorship in that country and elsewhere. As was already mentioned, I'm currently an affiliate of the Global Pontificate of Pius XII, Catholicism in a Divided World. And so this project was created when Pope Francis helpfully opened access to the archives of the papacy of Pius XII, which, as many of you will know, runs from 1939 to 1958. And as you can kind of see with these 2 pictures here, my own work within this project primarily has been progressing along 2 axes, one of which is looks at global networks created by the global deployment of foreign clergy, missionaries, and resources from North America and Europe to Latin America during the Cold War. And so you can see those are some priests from Milwaukee pointing at a map of all the places they placed their missionaries, as well as global networks created through the spread of Catholic action in the wake of World War II throughout the region. And so that last picture is some members of the JOC, the Catholic Youth Workers in Rio in the 1950s. And so this is where I'm largely approaching the Cold War. They're going to be most of the examples I'm going to draw upon. But of course, religion in the Cold War goes beyond Catholicism. So to start very broadly, I think we can look at this question of what was the Cold War, or how have scholars discussed what the Cold War is. So certainly in its oldest form, this was framed as a bipolar geopolitical conflict, one between the blocs led by the US and the USSR. It was something that was cold in its center, but certainly not so much in its peripheries, where the conflict was defined by a series of very bloody proxy wars. In subsequent decades, people have discussed the Cold War rather as a battle of ideas, and this is going to be particularly important for us today, I think. Even of modernities between a US-style liberal democracy, between capitalism and socialism, but also just the broader visions of a future society that the United States and the USSR represented. This is certainly a line of argument that I associate most with Otto and Westat, but there are many who have picked up and elaborated this over the last 15 years. So, further scholars have complicated what the Cold War actually was. One line of argument that I think is also important for our purposes today is this idea of a cultural Cold War. So in the present, we'll hear people on the right sometimes talk about cultural Marxism. That's not exactly what I'm talking about here, but rather the idea that within this kind of larger framework of a battle of ideas, a battle of modernities, that this included battles over over changing attitudes about gender, about sexuality, about morality. This is also something I think that refers to the degree to which the Cold War was prosecuted through emerging communications technologies, mass communications, through television, over radio. In my own work, you see the Catholic Church becoming incredibly interested in how it prosecutes the Cold War through television and radio, in particular in regions where literacy is low. And so this raises an important question about where and when did the Cold War begin? And even for scholars, I think, that have looked at the Cold War primarily within its centers, this question has become ever more and more complicated and ever more contested. But certainly, if we want to think about a global Cold War, then this question becomes all the more important. And I'll get to that in just a second. And in the last decade or so, I think we've seen a profusion of works that have dealt with the relationship between the Cold War and other global processes. So certainly decolonization, but also local and regional conflicts. Scholars have broadened the themes with which they have approached the conflict, including our focus today, religion. So in part, this broadening of the Cold War scholarship of what the Cold War is, the interrogation of origins, has led us to a question of geographies, right? And so I mentioned briefly this kind of original conception of the Cold War as a bipolar conflict, but this is, of course, no longer how most scholars discuss it. But the question becomes, what exactly makes the Cold War global? So in a very earlier period, these were works that focused on geopolitical groups that were beyond NATO and the Warsaw Pact, so things like the non-aligned movement. Scholars, particularly in my neck of the wood, have talked about internationalisms. So certainly within socialist internationalisms, there's Cuban, Nicaraguan, Yugoslavian versions. In kind of the other side of things, there's liberal internationalism and certainly Christian democratic internationalists as well. And this has also led to a series of conversations in different regions of the world, which have been perhaps overly disconnected from one another, about what the Cold War means in a given place. So to talk about what that looks like in Latin America, this is a chart. It's from a recent article that I highly recommend by one of my colleagues at UCL, Bill Booth. And he is looking at this idea, he is looking at what comprises the Cold War, and more specifically, what is the origin of the Cold War in Latin America. And the more and more that he looks at it, the further back he goes. So in this very complicated chart, if you look in the upper part of it, you see that this goes all the way back to colonization, to the landlord, the hacienda, to unequal forms of land ownership. It runs through the 19th century with the expansion of U.S. hegemony in the region, military intervention in the Caribbean, and in northern South America. And then the arrival of socialist ideas in the region in the early 20th century, and that all of these different bundles of conflicts gradually accumulate upon one another, and then the Cold War, rather than originating these conflicts, simply imposes a kind of organizing logic and discourse over them. So in this sense, it's a way of, within this larger debate among Latin American historians, of looking for what they would call the, quote, indigenous origins of the Cold War, which exists not in the conflict between Washington and Moscow, but rather in the long-running struggles over inequality that have sort of erupted into cycles of revolution and counter-revolution in Latin America. And so where does this leave us? What is the religious origins of the Cold War, or even the place of religion within the Cold War writ large? So one historiographic argument that I would make is that religion can be one stack in a larger stack of conflicts. So if we kind of go back to Bill Booth's kind of chart here, one that isn't here so much is this question of religion. But in particular, if we think of this sort of Westat style turn to the Cold War as a conflict of ideas, it's hard to look for a more prominent or fertile source of ideas and identity than religion. And so I'll touch on this briefly today when I turn to my case study, but in particular with World War II as this calamitous crisis at the heart of Western civilization. Many actors turn to religion as a way to make sense of it, and then subsequently to build political projects around. Of course, this is an academy focused on Christian democracy. But it is also a moment, and this is contingent upon Cold War processes, of the globalization of politics and culture. There's economic growth, there is increasing globalization through international organizations, through trade, connection, in a number of areas. And this comes with it changing attitudes towards gender and sexuality that become important for religious actors. And so certainly we can talk about this in terms of Christianity, or of a quote unquote Western civilization, but it expands beyond that, right? I wouldn't have time to talk about it today, but there's a great literature, for instance, on Islam and its responses to both encroachment by conflict with socialism, with atheistic socialism, as well as with the United States. But in part, our goal today is to move beyond the US-USSR dichotomy and think about what religion looks like in the global Cold War, right? And it's going to, I think it manifests itself sometimes in unpredictable ways. And so I think a useful example of what I mean by that is, we can take a pretty mainstream example in some respects, and that's, of course, the role of the Vatican in the Cold War. So, on the one hand, the Vatican especially under Pope Pius XII and then under John Paul II, were staunchly anti-communist, opposed to the Soviet Union, and directed the church to act as such. But at the same time, they were quite critical at times of US foreign policy, including the World War II policy of unconditional surrender of the Axis powers, criticisms of the Marshall Plan, that it would inoculate Europe with American Protestant values. And then later on, and later on in the Cold War, the Vatican became a source of criticism of the US human rights record in various corners of the world, not least in Latin America. And so I want to turn to a couple of central contentions that I'm then going to kind of flesh out, I think, a little bit in my case study here. And the first one shouldn't be particularly contentious or even perhaps even all that revelatory, but it's simply that religion matters to the Cold War, right? It motivates how people act. It becomes a source of inspiration for different forms of transnational connection, as we'll see. But I would caution as well that its relationship to the Cold War varies according to time and place. Certainly, religion arguably starts out as more important to the Cold War in Europe and perhaps becomes less important as the Cold War comes to a close. It's pivotal, for instance, in the Middle East in certain points, but perhaps less so in China, although I think we can make some counter arguments there as well. And the third is that religion matters greatly to diplomacy. It matters significantly, in particular, to US diplomacy, but certainly in the context of Christian democracy as well. And it's also a way for actors to form identity. It's a source of social mobilization in response to Cold War events. And I will talk about that a little bit in the context of my actors. And in particular, something that's very important for me and in my work is thinking about religion as a source for alternative geographies. So thinking about different places that are important to the larger unfolding of the Cold War, especially beyond Washington, Moscow, the usual haunts, as well as itineraries for looking at how people moved through the world and came to understand themselves. Again, beyond the typical stories. And it can even be, I would argue, a way to include actors that are often left out of Cold War history. So in my own work, that has been a variety of different kinds of people. In the first book, these are rural migrants to Brazilian cities who become really the heart of the liberationist Catholic Church in the 1970s and 80s. These are people who are often left out of this story, even in preference at times of liberation theologians themselves, but are nonetheless drivers and shakers of these events. Okay, so I want to transition now to this case study. And so this is going to look at the ebbs and flows of inter-American Catholic relations from about the period of World War II to the 1960s. And so in my project, the relationship between something that I've come to call the pre-shortage question and anti-communism in Latin America became very important. So like anti-communism, the shortage of priests means a great deal more than the mere phrase itself would indicate. In the 1930s, the Vatican began more systemic efforts through its nuncios to understand the weakness of the institutional church in Latin America. And from the beginning, part of this rationale for doing this was out of fear that if the institutional church was absent, that communists would fill that gap. But actually, communism in the beginning was but one potential competitor for Catholicism. There was Protestantism, Masonry, secularism, and fascism even to a degree. These were all included. And papal nuncios in the region and in foreign visitors alike often lauded with great relief that Latin Americans had retained religiosity despite the weakness of the institutional church. And if in the Q&A anybody's interested about why the church was so weak, we can talk about that. And so that is to say, for the Vatican and for non-Latin Americans, and even for many Latin Americans, the problem of the priest shortage was in part a problem of Latin America's lack of Romanization, essentially that too many Latin Americans, in the eyes of the Vatican, practiced the wrong sort of Catholicism. And this popular Catholicism that the Vatican and foreign visitors encountered was held to be less capable of standing up to socialism. And so the priest shortage, in reality, extended to a kind of a larger package of social Catholicism. It's the priest, but it's also religious life, Catholic social services, lay movements, and all the rest. And so, actually, no, stay on this one. Okay, so the question of the priest shortage came into focus for the Vatican in the 1930s. And in that decade, papal nuncios from across the region, including in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, all wrote to the Secretariat of State requesting new clergy. And I won't go into it too much, but in essence, the Vatican during World War II begins more concerted efforts to start sending clergy to the region, and it turns to the North American Church. Of course, by 1939, it's very difficult to get priests and missionaries out of Europe. And so an essential figure in that is the gentleman who's at the center of this photo. This is Amiato Cicognani, who is the Apostolic Delegate to the United States. He holds the post from 1933 to 1955. And so he becomes kind of the point person in trying to rally North American support for the church in Latin America. And so he has significant success with the press and setting up exchanges between Latin America, the Latin American and North American churches. The U.S. National Catholic Welfare Conference, which is the body of U.S. bishops, sets up a press, a Spanish and Portuguese language press. It starts sending money to the region. And they also kind of come together for a series of meetings. So in this picture, this is at the 1942 Inter-American Seminar on Social Studies, which is held in Washington, D.C., which brought together North American and Latin American clergy. On the left is Bishop Miguel de Andrea, who is from Argentina, and he was a kind of a prominent thinker on social Catholic issues. And on the right is one of the most powerful figures of the Mexican Church, Miguel Dario Miranda, who also becomes the president of the Latin American Episcopal Conference, CELAM. And so another prominent attendee was Nelson Rockefeller. So he is the gentleman in the tie in the upper right corner of this picture. And he was the head of the Office of Inter-American Affairs. And so President Roosevelt had created this office as part of his Good Neighbor policy, which aspired to build better relations between the United States and Latin America. But the policy also had a significant cultural component, and specifically a religious component. The office sent people like Walt Disney and Orson Welles to Latin America to make cartoons and things. That was probably more fun than receiving visits from American bishops, but the American bishops were sent as well, and Latin Americans brought to the United States. Indeed, so close was the collaboration between these two bodies that actually a member of the National Catholic Welfare Conference was appointed to the Office of Inter-American Affairs Advisory Board. And so part of this included sending, as I mentioned, American bishops to the region. One of these was a bishop from Omaha, Nebraska, and kind of tellingly, he ended up writing a report on his visit, and he sent one copy to the Department of State in the United States, and the other copy now rests in the Vatican archives. And so he travels around the region, and he kind of comes away with this idea that, well, previously, religion had actually separated the two Americas, North America, mainly the United States, but Latin America and Latin America, but that U.S. Catholics could form a bridge between the two to form a kind of Pan-American Catholic union. So this idea, which becomes one of the major contributions of the 1942 conference that I'm looking at in my work, essentially Cicognani and the rest of the U.S. bishops try to put some meat on those bones, so to speak. So I don't know if anybody recognizes this building. These are the headquarters of Mary Knoll, the Mary Knoll Missionary Order, which is the largest missionary order in the United States. For most of its existence, as you can tell, it had a focus on a different region of the world. It was founded primarily to evangelize East Asia. And in fact, this mission was so central to the mission, to the order's sort of sense of its own self, that they built their headquarters with what they kind of euphemistically called Asian design influences. When you actually go to do research here, they tell you to look for the building with Asian design influences. They won't give you an address. And I thought to myself, oh, I'm going to be on some architectural scavenger hunt. How will I ever find it? And I thought, oh, no, that's probably the one. But initially, when the Vatican wrote to Mary Knoll to send missionaries to Latin America, they said, we would love to, but we're kind of busy in China, Japan, and the Philippines, so no thanks. But the head of the order, a man named James Walsh, eventually does decide to go on a trip to Latin America, and this becomes the origins of a sustained and still present series network of missions by Mary Knoll in the region. But in part, one of the reasons why Mary Knoll ultimately decides to send missionaries to Latin America is because it gets kicked out of much of East Asia. So during the Chinese Revolution, so certainly during World War II, Japan expels the missionaries wherever it finds them, wherever in territory that it takes. But after World War II, during the Chinese Civil War, and in the ultimate victory of Mao Zedong, this leads to the expulsion of most of Mary Knoll's missionary corps. So they are, so to speak, unemployed and looking for somewhere else to go. So they end up, for the most part, in Latin America. And this connection of the pre-shortage to fears on communism becomes closer after the war as the Cold War heats up. So one particularly notable incident in 1947 that I uncovered in the Vatican archives involves reports from the Papal Nuncio in Argentina about Soviet aid to the Argentine Communist Party, one that extended to allegations that the Czechoslovakian embassy was also serving as a front for socialist infiltration in Buenos Aires. And so in Rome, the Secretary of State, Tardini, ultimately passes this information to U.S. representatives there, who pass it to their own government through Myron Taylor, who was the U.S. government to the Pope at the time. And so this actually becomes the sort of inciting incident in a long-running collaboration between the Vatican, U.S. church members, and the U.S. government. So in the 1950s, Vatican and U.S. interests would actually converge in two places, primarily in Guatemala and in Bolivia. So in the former, in Guatemala, the U.S. led a campaign against the center-left president, Jacobo Arbenz, that culminated his overthrow by a coup in 1954. In Bolivia, the Movimiento Nacional Revolucionario, or MNR, staged a revolt after being denied the presidency, despite it winning the 1951 elections. And so once in power, the MNR began a series of social reforms and nationalizations, including of Bolivia's mining industry. And so in the wake of this, of the Bolivian Revolution, there was a great deal of alarm in Washington and Vatican. Mary Knoll had chosen Bolivia for its first mission, in part because it had an emphasis on evangelization among indigenous people, but also because the church in Bolivia was exceptionally understaffed. So in the wake of the 1952 revolution, letters from the Papal Nuncio and Bolivian bishops directly tied this shortage of priests to the threat of social revolution. And so the concerned parties felt that even with the arrival of orders like Mary Knoll, that this was not enough, that they needed direct help from U.S. archdioceses. So one such letter, which was from the Archbishop Abel Antezana y Rojas of La Paz, went to Cardinal Joseph Ritter of St. Louis. In 2 years before Fide Donum would encourage diocesan priests to become involved in missionary work, Ritter, in conversation with the U.S. bishops and with the nuncios, responded affirmatively. And so St. Louis became the first U.S. archdiocese to set up its own mission parish, in this case in La Paz. And here you can see Ritter on one of his visits to Bolivia. And why, there's a question like, why did Ritter take this up before anyone else? Well, in part it had to do with his particular political disposition. Ritter was a relatively progressive figure in a lot of ways. He was the first to desegregate Catholic schools over bitter white opposition. And so this kind of entailed a certain affinity for a kind of liberal internationalism, which would become closely associated with the Kennedys. So in 1956, St. Louis sends these 3 priests, pictured here. They would spend over 40 years in Bolivia. They would be ultimately imprisoned by Bolivia's later dictatorship. Father Kennedy, who's the gentleman in the middle, eventually becomes the Vicar General of La Paz. He becomes actually the secretary of the Bolivian Bishops' Conference. So he's quite a high-ranking figure. The gentleman on the right becomes the auxiliary bishop of La Paz, and then becomes a bishop in his own right. And so you actually see the ascension of a large number of St. Louis priests in the Bolivian hierarchy. And so can we say, in some respects, that the St. Louis parish in La Paz was an anti-communist exercise, given its inception and the kind of panicked response to the 1952 revolution? So certainly the American Catholics who were involved opposed communism in theory, and viewed their presence as a bulwark against it. But I think it's useful to distinguish what they actually did and what they understood communism to be. So this is the first public mass that the priests celebrated in La Paz as they built their parish, which is called Cristo Rey, in an outlying area of La Paz. And so like a lot of missions that were established in these years, this was in the urban peripheries of the city, where rural migrants would settle on cheap land far from the city center. And so over the following couple of years, St. Louis would found actually kind of a network of parishes, some among indigenous Aymara people in the countryside, elsewhere in La Paz, and even into northern Chile. And so across these parishes, what kind of ends up happening is a kind of social program to address the material poverty of area residents that went hand in hand with installing active religious life. And so I'm just going to run through very quickly some of these pictures of what they got up to. So these are kind of food relief efforts, the Catholic Relief Services. There were efforts to dig wells and to improve sanitation in these neighborhoods. They established like a pharmacy and a medical clinic. This is one of the priests with, he's a local trade unionist, Catholic trade unionist, so they got involved in the labor movement. This is a group, a mothers club. So, a group of mothers who would meet to discuss issues in their neighborhood and issues with family life. This is another picture of one of the masses. It's a confession. Okay. And so this is actually where I kind of want to go next, which is, she is a papal volunteer for Latin America. This is a program that gets created in the 1960s, and she's teaching English in the parish. And so to kind of situate ourselves before we kind of launch into the last part of this, I would say that the question of the shortage of priests, well, seemingly a simple idea, a sort of an issue of personnel, initially had relatively little to do with communism. And rather, it sort of had to do with fears of a lack of Romanization of the Catholic Church in Latin America by outside observers. But still, this question becomes linked to the Cold War after World War II, as North Americans, the Vatican, and indeed many conservative Latin American bishops become afraid of the advance of communism. And so these fears of communism were not augmented by actual communists initially. It changes a little bit after the Cuban Revolution, but not entirely, but rather by attempts by left of center governments to address inequality through social reforms. So it wouldn't be accurate, I think, to say that it sought to address poverty merely to ward off communists, but rather that in the process of responding to these events, that we see the origins of what we might call a Catholic third way response to the Cold War. Of course, that's not how everyone felt about this. So in the 1960s, after the Cuban Revolution, the US markedly intensifies its engagement with Latin America, so US Catholics. So to direct this initiative, the American bishops created a Latin American Bureau in 1959. You can see their pamphlet on the right there, which is under the direction of John Considine, who was a Maryknoll missionary. And the lab collected funds for Latin American bishops. It set up inter-American deliberative bodies, held conferences to discuss the direction of the church, and also created new programs to transfer clergy and missionaries and lay people to the region. And so in 1961, one of those groups was the Papal Volunteers for Latin America, which goes by the acronym of PAVLA. And that would exist for about a decade before it closes in 1971. And so the Cuban Revolution, of course, is the kind of the impetus for this, although this idea had been around for a little while. But this chronic shortage of priests and parishes across Latin America now seem to be an enormous strategic liability. But from its start, Pavla really struggles to resolve this kind of key tension over its purpose. So in the era of Vatican II, was Pavla an expression of a global lay apostolate, or was its aim simply to fight communism in the Americas in close collaboration with US policy? So Pavla came into existence during a time when there was a great deal of institutional change within the Catholic Church. We don't have time to go into all of it. Of course, there's the creation of Salam. There's all different kinds of bodies that were created in North American and in European churches, funnel this deployment of personnel to the region. But Pavla was very interesting in that it deeply connected local communities in the United States to communities in Latin America. There's this whole kind of elaborate ceremony that they would do for volunteers that would go. But it also inaugurated a kind of new geography for the Cold War in the region. So Pavla volunteers would undertake training first in their diocese of origin, and then they would go to a national training center, usually in Washington, D.C. And then depending on whether they were going to Spanish-speaking or Portuguese-speaking Latin America, they would either go to the Central Intercultural Formation in Cuernavaca in Mexico, or to the University of Puerto Rico, or to Petrópolis in Brazil. And by 1961, these volunteers would begin to make its way to Latin America. So I want to talk very briefly about some of these actors who created religious Cold War projects kind of on top or through Pavla. So one of these people was Father James Duffy, who is pictured on the left here. And so he's a priest from the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. And he serves as the sort of director of Milwaukee's Pavla program. And so in his training materials that I consulted in Milwaukee, I found that he focused on Brazil to a kind of startling degree. And the question becomes, why was he so interested in Brazil specifically? And the answer to that question actually leads us to another conclusion that I want to leave you with, which is that it would not be accurate to say that Duffy's desire to kind of mount an anti-communist effort through Pavla was his own idea, but rather that it was formed in close consultation with Latin American interlocutors. So in 1962, a Brazilian priest who's in charge of kind of religious orders in the territory sends a letter to the American bishops requesting specifically American priests and volunteers for the northeast of Brazil, which is an agricultural region, primarily agricultural region, with a high degree of land conflict. And so Duffy, as part of this outreach, then goes to Brazil and he begins meeting with with Brazilian bishops, in particular with one named Dom Eugenio Salles, who's in the city of Natal. And Salles has created this kind of system of mass communications efforts, of layperson organizations, of social outreach in an effort to counter perceived communist success in this region. And so when Duffy comes back, he writes all these manuals, and I just read a few quotes that he kind of gives in these materials. He says things like, "South America stands at a crossroads, wondering which way to turn. One road leads to communism, and the other to Christ." And then again, Cuba and Castro lie only a short distance off the coast of South America and are broadcasting their message of communist revolution to the continent. But Duffy's engagement actually leads to itineraries that go beyond a sort of strict Cold War framework. So on the left is a family, the Nelson family from Wisconsin, who end up living in Dom Salis's archdiocese in northeastern Brazil. There are also figures like Sonia Vieira Alves, who is from the Brazilian Amazon. She actually goes to Wisconsin, teaches English to papal volunteers there, and then ultimately goes on to have a whole career in Europe as a Catholic student and then social worker. So one of these interactions actually leads to Milwaukee founding its own missionary parish, not in Brazil, but in Paraguay. And so what can the analyzing religion in a Cold War context tell us about these networks? Well, these are some stats from Pavla's volunteer distribution in 1964, so it's kind of a brief snapshot. And so some interesting kind of things, ideas emerge. So if you know anything about the geography of American Catholicism, most American Catholics generally reside in East Coast cities. So you think places like New York, Philadelphia, Boston. But if we look at the archdiocese that actually sent volunteers, you notice that in the top 10, only one of them, Davenport, Connecticut, is not in the American Midwest, right? So why did American Midwesterners embrace this religious Cold War mission so much more than others? All different kind of interesting reasons for that. And then we have also the question of the distribution of these volunteers. So it does sort of track broadly with population, but you see that Brazil is miles ahead, over twice as much as the next largest country. And that likely has to do with US fears and sort of broader Cold War fears that really focused on Brazil in that moment, which ultimately culminate in the 1964 military coup there. And then you can kind of go down the list. It's also who ultimately embraces the program, who chooses to join it. So it's overwhelmingly women, college-educated, generally women who choose to do this. And a common story among these people is that this program becomes a way, especially for women from traditionally conservative families, to travel abroad. It's kind of a way to do the Peace Corps, but in a religious sense. And so that is a different element of the program as well. And so to sum up talking about Pavla and to kind of transfer to some more general conclusions, you can also detect through these networks shifting attitudes towards what the Latin American church is, what it's capable of, and what it's for. So in the newspaper that the North American bishops, the US bishops, publish, there was always an appeal for funds that would go towards things like supporting volunteers, building seminaries, and a larger kind of package of Catholic activities in the region. And so on the left, we have the funding appeal that they use for most of the 1960s, which is hungry kids make hardy rebels, right? And so this is phrasing religious aid as basically a counterinsurgency program, which is very much in keeping with Cold War rhetoric in the wake of the Cuban Revolution. And so this was always accompanied by a picture of children, oftentimes, although not always, in context that suggested poverty and miseration. But over the course of the 1960s, there's a great deal of criticism of the US mission in the region for its kind of overtones of cultural imperialism. There is the emergence of ideas about the Catholic Church having a unique mission to be on the side of the poor. This, of course, is kind of the origins of the idea of the Latin American Church as the preferential option for the poor, and the seeds of what would become liberation theology. And so on the right, you can see what happens after 1968, after Medellin, where CELAM holds its second conference. They have changed the fundraising pitch. And rather, they're now saying we've stopped building cathedrals and started building the church. And you see a kind of a tagline, the Church of God's Poor. And so ultimately what happens is a sort of fracturing of this US effort. Many of the conservatives retreat from it, but then some progressives really embrace it and become part of progressive and liberationist networks that become particularly important in the 1970s and 80s. So Pablo is ultimately shuttered in 1971, in so much both for these reasons, these kind of reasons of the critique of cultural imperialism of U.S. efforts, but also because sending college students ended up not being very cost efficient, and they weren't terribly effective at actually doing things like alleviating poverty. But Pablo kind of occupies an unusual place within this history of the lay apostolate of the Cold War. It was a kind of a missionary program with a neo-colonial outlook. It deployed foreign lay people to another region. And this distinguished Pablo from other groups that you might be familiar with, like Catholic Action, whose members frequently traveled and built connections, but whose day-to-day actions mainly focused on their countries of origin. So a couple of conclusions kind of pivot back to our contentions. I think that this intermingling of U.S. foreign policy and Catholicism's own execution of the Cold War tells a couple of things. And one of which is that considering religion really does offer the potential for imagining new geographies, itineraries, as I've mentioned, of the Cold War. In this case, we saw several that were created through these 30 years of Pan-American, inter-American Catholic connections. And there's also this idea that the relationship of religion to the Cold War ebbed and flowed. So indeed, this kind of quintessential question of the Cold War Latin America for the global church, the shortage of priests, initially had almost nothing to do with communism, but it became basically a referendum on whether the church would be able to turn back the tide of communism. And then, over the course of the Cold War, as a result of these inter-American and Pan-American connections, emerged liberationist and progressive networks that become important, for instance, in the formation of a transnational human rights movement in the 1970s and 80s. Thirdly, that religion, of course, is never monolithic. Latin American Catholicism was very different than North American Catholicism. The expectations of Rome differed from that of their American counterparts and their Latin American counterparts. And certainly there was an enormous amount of internal diversity within Latin American Catholicism itself, from kind of political wings, progressive, conservative, to the respective histories of national churches that become really important in this transnational moment. And finally, religion functioned as a tool of diplomacy, but it also conditioned people's responses to the Cold War. American and Latin American Catholics in these networks that I mentioned came to see each other differently. They had different kinds of connections than they had previously. And for many, it became a way to create a uniquely Catholic response to the Cold War, to step out beyond the US-USSR binary. And then for others like Father Duffy, they saw nothing wrong with uniting the US's role and leadership in the Cold War with the Catholic mission. So that variety exists there as well. So I think I've talked long enough. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Many thanks. Really interesting lecture, and I think we have 15 minutes for questions or suggestions or comments. So, Peter.
Peter Herman Kadok, thanks a lot for your fascinating paper and speech. I had a question on how these Pavla volunteers looked at their European counterparts, especially while talking from Belgium or other Western European countries. There were similar frameworks in which volunteers, more or less linked to Catholic action movements, including the JOC that you mentioned, were sent to Latin America already in the 40s. So it goes back quite early. And if you take into account the colleges that were erected in several European countries training priests for Latin America, You can go back to the 19th century, of course. Huh? So my question is a bit how those American volunteers in Pavla saw their own role in relationship to European volunteers. Were they seen as trustworthy or not? For instance?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. Yeah, I mean, and it speaks to this profusion of geographies that when you bring religion into the question emerges, and certainly I've been to Kadak before and seen these documents myself. But to answer your question, in a very American fashion, Pavla and its backers almost ignored the existence of European volunteers in the region, lay volunteers and in clergy to some respects. And so you'll see in their own documents, in their training manuals, in their reports, this kind of argument that no other lay volunteer programs existed, that this was the first one of its kind in the very late date of 1961. And I think that this was they were trying to make an argument that this is an important initiative, that it's unique, and to generate enthusiasm for it. Of course, once they're in the field, do these volunteers encounter their European counterparts or become more aware of the larger network and profusion of volunteers beyond North America? And interestingly, I haven't found much evidence for that. It is a sort of bizarre sort of historical amnesia about the larger efforts of the Catholic Church in the region. There's some idea that there are foreign missionary orders, and they do encounter them, but this program kind of gets run as a little bit of a silo, and I think that might have to do actually with particularly after the foundation of the Pontifical Commission for Latin America, that they do end up splitting up territory a little bit between these different organizations. So the Americans who arrive in very large numbers in the 1960s are directed towards very particular places. And so it's also possible that in this distribution of individuals that they are sent to places where European volunteers are not, in essence. But in general, yeah, they sort of make this argument that, nothing before Pavla existed, and this is a completely unique sort of mission and crusade. Yeah.
Hello, Wolfram Kaiser, University of Portsmouth in the UK. I have a question that is going in the same direction, in a sense, but looking at the question of interconfessional cooperation and competition. So my question here is whether, especially in countries with significant Protestant minorities in Southern America, whether there was any competition from American Protestant churches there in terms of the interconfessional dimension, or whether cooperation in terms of the Cold War perspective prevailed over confessional competition between the churches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in this question of the ebbs and flows of the relationship to the Cold War, the Protestant issue is, it pre-exists the Cold War, really. And at different points over the course of the 20th century, it becomes more or less important. But it's enormous. I mean, the number of Protestant missionaries in Latin America. So there was one report that I can remember off the top of my head. This was in the late 1930s, where as the papal nuncios are doing these surveys of how many priests are in a given Latin American country or Latin American city, that in Costa Rica, there were 3 times as many Protestant missionaries as there were Catholic priests. And this horrifies the Vatican. And so this is very much framed in competition. And Latin American bishops are also invested in fighting off Protestants, basically. And oftentimes they will appeal more to that in requesting aid, priests, lay people, connections with their North American counterparts than communism. So for instance, there's appeals to, how can you do the good neighbor policy if you're allowing all these American Protestant missionaries to come to Catholic Latin America, so they're writing to their Catholic counterparts in the United States? Can you lobby Roosevelt and Truman to make them stop? And of course, the Catholic Church in the United States says, well, we'll try, but we don't think we're going to be very successful. And so they do actually send a letter through, and this is if you want to access power in the US government, you send it to the Assistant Postmaster General, who eventually gets it onto Roosevelt's desk. but in the long run, yeah, this remains an enormous concern, and anybody who's familiar with the contemporary religious dynamics in Latin America knows that even as their focus in the earlier part of the century is on mainline Protestant missionaries, who they ultimately end up losing to in many regions are Pentecostals who arrive in particularly large numbers in the 1970s and 1980s. And that's a whole different story, but in short, yeah, it's enormously important.
I have simply, I don't know if a question, a curiosity, a suggestion to this. Religion and politics during the Cold War. But the communists had a sort of religious approach to the Cold War themselves in Latin America. Is it possible to imagine something of this?
Yeah. So in my first book, which focuses on urban peripheries and the creation of the popular church in the 1970s and 80s, when the church begins founding parishes in these newly expanding urban areas, a lot of the priests who come are from abroad, but they also need to staff social services. So they invite doctors, nurses, teachers, and all of that. Well, who wants to go and work in poor areas in expanding urban centers? Well, they kind of usually had some sort of ideological reason for doing so. So many of the people who come to staff Catholic outreach services are members of either socialist or communist parties. There was a phrase that one militant once shared to me. He called it hiding underneath the skirts of the church. So it was a way of continuing to do kind of popular organizing work while remaining somewhat safe from the repressive and from political police and the repressive apparatus of dictatorships. This actually becomes so much of a problem that, as one Brazilian bishop related to me, that John Paul II will ask about this specifically during his trips to the region after he becomes Pope. But in many places, and I can think of examples in Chile and in Peru, there is a coexistence and sometimes not an official collaboration, but people operating with similar grassroots methodologies and similar ideas about how popular power might transform society, albeit in very different directions between the Catholics and the communists. But their methods look relatively similar, the grassroots methods that they utilize. And so in Brazil, many of the militant activists that I interviewed in the peripheries had either started as members of the Catholic grassroots and then become members of the Maoist-line Communist Party of Brazil, or had worked alongside them as when they had common aims. And so this kind of line, which is very stark in other places, is never so stark in Latin America as it is elsewhere, particularly in that kind of later stage of the Cold War. Yeah, so it's an interesting question.
Thank you. More questions or comments? Seems not. So thank you again, Professor McDonald, for this really inspiring lecture. I have learned many things this evening. I'm sure that you will have done the same to this. I hope that the two lectures will be very useful for our early career scholars. So it is with pleasure that I close our workshop today, or we will meet together tomorrow morning for the visit to the Sturzo, and then in the afternoon for the first presentations and the discussions of your papers. So thank you very much for staying with us.
Yeah, and thank you so much, everyone. And I love it when people get in touch, so feel free to shoot me an email. I'd love to hear from you. Take care.